25th of August 2023 marked the 6th anniversary of the start of a massive offensive by Myanmar's military against the mainly Muslim minority in Rakhine State. The then UN Commissioner for Human Rights called the brutal campaign to drive their community from their homes a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Some 10,000 Rohingya men, women and children were killed and more than 300 villages burnt to the ground, and over 700,000 people were forced to flee to neighbouring Bangladesh in search of safety. In all, over 1 million Rohingya have fled persecution and systematic discrimination to seek international refugee protection in Bangladesh, and approximately 600,000 still remain within Rakhine State, where they continue to suffer severe rights restrictions and the threat of further violence. To mark the 6-year anniversary, Mr. Tom Andrews, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation in Myanmar, appealed to world leaders to take action and to hold accountable the architects and perpetrators of the violence. In underscoring the need for tangible action, Mr. Andrews made this powerful statement. The Rohingya are tired of empty promises. Their children cannot eat political rhetoric or UN resolutions that go nowhere. They need and deserve the world to end the deadly paralysis of indifference. We cannot let another year go by without principled and decisive action to support justice and accountability for the Rohingya. The Asia-Pacific region has a long relationship with different forms of international criminal law and impunity for mass atrocities. Civil society activists and lawyers working in the region are increasingly advocating for various pathways to seek justice and accountability, just as Mr. Andrews points out. Our guest today wrote a piece where she talked about how impunity has been the norm in the region, with little to no accountability for perpetrators. At the Assembly of State Parties in UN headquarters, I met up with Priya. Hi, Priya.
Hi, Yasin.
Wonderful to be able to sit and talk to you here at UN headquarters in New York, where we are both here for the Assembly of State Parties session for the International Criminal Courts. So I wanted to, first of all, ask you to introduce the work of the organization that you're here to represent, that is the Asia Justice Coalition, and tell us about the priorities that you bring with you to New York for what is the Assembly of the States and Observers and Civil Society, a big, important meeting in the context of the ICC's work. So tell us a bit more.
With pleasure. And firstly, thank you for having me on. And it's lovely to meet you after 16 plus years.
I know.
It's been a long time. I think I'll segue straight to the Asia Justice Coalition. We're a young fledgling coalition that started in 2018 in the aftermath of the crisis in Myanmar, the mass clearance operations conducted by the Myanmar military, which resulted in the displacement and, mass atrocities against the Rohingya minority population, which forced them to flee into Bangladesh, nearly 1 million people. And at that point, the realization was that there was not enough coordination between national, regional, and international actors, specifically in the civic society space. So the idea was to get a group of organizations together that would bridge these gaps and that would coordinate more, and that we would help sort of facilitate justice processes, that we would help push the envelope on accountability for the victims and accountability for these mass atrocities. So that was really the germ. That was the initial idea of the coalition. And actually, it was with a very specific aim. When we came together, it was to push and advocate for an international mechanism. Now, as it so happened that within 2 months of our getting together and agreeing to move forward, the mechanism was already green-lighted by the Human Rights Council. So at that point, we went back to the table to say, okay, well, one big task is done. No thanks to us, but it now is prioritized to follow the work of the mechanism and continue engaging, but what else can we do?
Yes.
And at that point, we sort of mapped the accountability sphere in the context of the Asia-Pacific region and decided that we wanted to focus also on the International Criminal Court proceedings. We wanted to focus on the International Court of Justice. We wanted to focus on universal jurisdiction. So, quite ambitious in terms of looking at all these big picture accountability spaces, but also how they would apply to this particular situation, and leveraging the work that members have done in different regions, thematically, globally, and sort of coordinating much more closely on what everyone's doing and how they're doing it. And we were sort of the central hub or the repository in terms of saying, well, look, if a smaller organization has done very specific work linked to the Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar, how can they be supported by a larger organization within the coalition? So that was really the genesis, and we are now focusing, in 2021, there was a coup in Myanmar.
Yeah.
So our focus expanded geographically and thematically to Myanmar as well, not just the Rohingya, but sort of more broadly what was happening in the country. And, just to say that there are still atrocities being committed with impunity right now.
Yeah.
So it's not something that has died out, or it's not something that has been solved. This is still very much an active live issue, and we still need to focus on it.
So even though it might be out of certain international headlines,
Exactly.
it's important for people to be aware, who may not be, that this is still an ongoing issue.
Exactly, a very much ongoing issue. And I think from, just looking at it from a regional perspective as well, it is really important because there are no regional mechanisms, there are no regional courts, there are not enough avenues. And so the ICC, the ICJ, universal jurisdiction, these take on the burden regionally is also on these processes, which is that it's relevant not just for Myanmar, but it is also a bit of a model for what might come or what we might need to look at in the region sort of for the future. In terms of the ICC specifically, for me, this is a really important venue because we have the situation in Bangladesh and the Republic of Myanmar. There's an investigation ongoing. It's now been, nearly 4 years. And to see progress, to see what comes next, I think that is critical. And so that's one of the reasons that we're here. But we're also here to see the coalition as an actor that connects the dots between the global thematic discussions that are going on, between the regional and between the national. So we're really sort of hopping back and forth between these three spheres and trying to, get our local partners to sort of engage more in some of the international processes and vice versa. It cannot be top down as well.
Yes.
There needs to be a groundswell, literally, of support, of engagement, and I see our role as making those connections.
So I think it would be really helpful as well to articulate in more detail some of the violations that you want our listeners, again, to really picture in their minds and understand the severity of the things that are going on. I think currently, as we record, as of December 2024, we see mass atrocities on our TVs in the context of Palestine and Israel. And I think what it's useful for our listeners to think about is what does that look like in the context of Asia and specifically the jurisdictions you're talking about? What kinds of crimes, what kinds of violations are going on? Would you be able to just paint us a bit of a picture?
Unfortunately, yes. Let's focus specifically on Bangladesh, Myanmar. And the one thing I'll say is, why do I say Bangladesh, Myanmar?
Yeah.
It's because this is a very particular situation where you have Myanmar that is not a state party to the ICC, and you have Bangladesh that is a state party to the ICC. And so the previous prosecutor at the ICC used a really innovative approach. She said, well, you have people who are fleeing mass atrocities, who have had violations committed against them, sexual and gender-based violence, disappearances, murder, torture, rape. You name it, and that's happened. That's been committed against this community. And they've crossed the border into Bangladesh. And the potential for continuing crimes, the link to territorial jurisdiction that is, that Bangladesh has been a state party since 2010.
Yes.
And this was quite a new approach. It's never been done before at the ICC, that there's a cross-border element. And so the focus really was on forcible transfer and deportation, to say that those are continuing crimes, they're linked to the territory of Bangladesh, and because of that, that is something that the prosecutor has jurisdiction to look into. Based on that, there was an appeals chamber, there was a trial chamber decision. The prosecutor went to a trial chamber to say, look, this is what we're thinking on jurisdiction, can we proceed?
Yes.
And in 2019, the trial chamber came out with a decision on the authorization to investigate, to approve the investigation. Paragraph 74 of the decision opens the door, I think, to more than deportation, other inhumane acts and persecution. Those are listed clearly, but I think the door is open for the prosecutor to be creative and innovative and see what else can fit within the purview of this jurisdictional box that they are sort of having to fit within. On the crimes in general, so separate from the ICC, there is also a case before the International Court of Justice, which has been brought by the Gambia on behalf of other states to say that potentially there are violations of the Genocide Convention.
That's right.
And that it is so abhorrent that the Gambia has stepped up and said, well, if nobody else is going to go to the ICJ, we are going to do this because it shocks the conscience of humanity. It's something that should not be acceptable to any state party of the Genocide Convention. So that's another element that is being looked at, linked to state responsibility, not individual criminal responsibility. But I think that's equally important to follow and to keep track of. It's now at the stage where there has been a provisional measures order. It's crossed the jurisdictional threshold. So now it's the merits phase.
Yes.
So piecing these together, you can see that the picture is crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and these are all linked only to this one instance or one context of the Rohingya, the mass atrocities and the clearance operations. Keep in mind now what's happening in Myanmar is that the military is conducting operations against its own population across the country. So it's not just in Rakhine State, which is where the Rohingya are based. And the Commission of Crimes Against Humanity, have been documented. You also have what is called the International Mechanism for Myanmar, which is similar to Syria. They're the only two in the world right now that are collecting evidence. And I think a lot of the evidence that they're collecting is linked directly to crimes against humanity that are being committed with impunity right now.
Thank you. And I think it's interesting then to kind of recognize the wider architecture of international justice, if I can use that term in its broadest and most expansive fashion. And I think you beautifully outlined that in terms of the international, the kind of regional space, as well as the national. And I think the national is something I would like to hear more of you kind of reflecting upon in the ways in which I think civil society can mobilize in the face of perhaps some very hesitant or belligerent states who may not be as keen to participate in the project of international justice for lots of different reasons. So would you talk to us a little bit about civil society power in this context and the importance of it?
Absolutely. I mean, critically important. And, this is something that I am going to say in the general debate today as well, that you need to engage with civil society because in many instances, including in Myanmar, CSOs are the key. They are the ones that actually permit access, while states do not. So in Myanmar,
that's right.
International institutions do not have access to the territory. The information that you're getting is really civil society organizations putting themselves on the front line and getting information out to these institutions, which with great cost to themselves, with life and limb at stake, quite literally.
Yes.
We know lawyers in Myanmar who have been jailed, who have been detained, who have been representing people before the Myanmar courts, trying to work within a legal system which is right now pitted against them. But they're still trying to work within that system and do their job. And it's taking a massive toll. So I think the recognition that CSOs are at the front line and that you have to engage with them, and you also have to be very conscious of security risks and everything else that goes along with that. I think in terms of the international architecture, so I'll draw an example. We're right now focused also on Crimes Against Humanity Treaty,
Yes.
which is, gathering momentum now. We're entering a pivotal 10 months. And just to explain that it's right now, it's not a treaty discussion yet, but the hope is that it will be. And it is important because, frankly, we're seeing the Commission of Crimes Against Humanity globally around us with no abate and, with complete impunity. So that's something that is important. And for the purposes of the Crimes Against Humanity discussion, the engagement of civil society organizations in countries that are doing this work is crucial. But also to recognize that it is also very difficult and dangerous for many of them. So it has to be a collaboration between all of us. So civil societies that are working regionally, globally, nationally, to sort of take the load and to say, well, if you can articulate your concerns or your arguments, if the space is safe enough for you to make those arguments internally, that's one way of doing things. If it's not safe enough, if you can send your arguments externally through other channels, so there are multiple ways that we have to work, but we all have to work together on these initiatives because otherwise the needle is not going to get moved.
Yeah.
So part of my bilateral discussions at this ASP have been with a lot of my civil society colleagues in the developing world to say, this is what is going on globally as well. These are the thematic areas to focus on, which are directly relevant. For example, in the Philippines, the war on drugs.
Yes. Yeah.
It's really, crimes against humanity.
Yes.
And how to make those connections as well. So yeah, I mean, it sounds a bit naive, it sounds a bit cliched maybe, but I think it is all of us working together in the best way that we can and in multiple different ways as well. Like, let's be smart about how we strategize, about how we work, and, to push these constantly forward because, I mean, there is still a massive impunity gap. The ecosystem and the architecture has huge holes and we need to start plugging those holes. I feel like it's a bit like being before a dike and trying to sort of plug the dike constantly. But
as the water's flooding
in, exactly. And we still keep building the bricks, right? So I think that's what we're trying to do. It can, and I'll be frank, I think especially, with these weeks, it can seem quite hopeless as well.
Yes.
And I think there's that sense in a lot of the people that I'm speaking to. But even more reason to dig in and do more better and do it in as sort of smart a manner that we can with the limitations of, resources and whatever constraints that we have. So yeah, it's a space that we just need to keep working together, I think.
And I think one of those significant gaps that you mentioned, and that was where you and I both reunited in person, was around the crimes against humanity, the kind of normative gap. And when I say normative gap, depending on the level of expertise people listening may have, crimes against humanity does not have its own standalone treaty. We have the Genocide Convention, we have the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, all dealing with the kind of conduct and the laws of war. It is interesting that we have this significant gap for what is one of our most serious international crimes. And so when it comes to even the public imagination, and we see people invoking the term genocide, talking about war crimes, I always find it interesting that they don't do the same when it comes to the terminology, the vernacular of crimes against humanity. Can you tell us why is it important to continue to commit to the work of crimes against humanity and the development of a separate, hopefully, a treaty that speaks directly to this?
Absolutely. So exactly as you say, I mean, I think in the public imagination, it's sort of war crimes, genocide, the hierarchy that seems to have been created, and crimes against humanity, which I think are the most rampant. They are applicable in times of war, they are applicable in peacetime. So the distinction between war crimes and crimes against humanity as well is really important. And I think on the treaty specifically, the idea is that you do not have a treaty that would hold states to account.
That's right.
That would have states commit to not committing these crimes. And I think that is something that is really important. If you look at the Genocide Convention, you have obligations of prevention, you have obligations of, prosecution, of redress. That does not exist in the crimes against humanity space. And this is specifically, something that we need to place that obligation on states very clearly to ensure that they prevent and do not commit these crimes. And so I think the treaty is of huge significance. It fills a gap. The argument that I've heard also is, look, you've got the Rome Statute.
Yeah.
Crimes against humanity, Article 7, it's there.
Why do we need another?
It's quite simple. Yes, you have the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute was there to create a court, and that court can now apply the crimes within the statute, in this particular context. They can hold individuals to account. But that does not apply to holding states to account. So that's a massive gap, and we need to be able to hold states to account to say, do the work to prevent this. It's not just about prosecution and punishment. That's too late for many people. Yes, it's something that we still need to do, but you've already lost lives. You've had, mass atrocities committed. So you need to prevent this.
Yeah.
And you need to commit to prevent this as well. And you need that commitment to be a legal obligation that you can then be held to account if you violate. And so I think that's really one of the strengths of having this treaty. And I think from the domestic perspective, it's incredibly important to have something like this normatively, to have states sign on to it, to then implement it domestically, and to have national law that is modeled along this, that will then apply it in courts as well. And there are massive gaps across the world. We've seen that a lot of this is not codified in national domestic law. And so, there is a gap in addressing these within a domestic context as well. So it functions at multiple levels, and it's important for the domestic application. It's important for states to have these obligations and to commit to them. I can't emphasize enough the importance of this moment as well, because we're in a crucial few months where the Sixth Committee has been looking at this quite seriously. There are going to be discussions in April, and then there will be discussions in October, at which point that's going to be the crucial point which will decide whether this then goes into a treaty negotiation process. We're still a long way away. I mean, the treaty negotiation process could take a long time, but this is a pivotal moment in making that move forward.
Yeah. I want to bring us to a really interesting kind of perspective. And by that, I mean, we're here engaging with the work of the ICC. But what happens if we turn things on its head? What could the ICC learn, do better, improve, if it looked and was inspired by the work going on in Asia across accountability, international justice? Yes, what would the ICC learn if it looked to Asia for inspiration?
Well, I think a number of things. I think the first is sort of just looking at domestic jurisdictions. And this is something that, in all fairness, the ICC has said that they are going to prioritize in terms of complementarity. Saying that domestic jurisdictions really should have primacy and should be the ones tackling these issues to start with. But then it also is a matter of capacity.
Yeah.
So I think the ICC can look to domestic jurisdictions for innovations in the law, for new approaches to deal with some of this. I think there are definitely capacity gaps in some areas. I think there's a lack of political will also to ensure that you've got these provisions codified, to ensure that prosecutions move forward on some of these crimes. I think it's a mix of really looking at the work that I'm sorry to plug civil society, but really, I really do feel like those are the organizations to reach out to and to really connect with and understand what they're doing, because the local context is important.
Yeah.
Context is everything, and that's crucial when you're looking at issues of, language barriers and the ability. And when I mean translation from the legalese into communities that are affected and how you approach these communities, bringing justice closer home. It's great that we have the ICC, that we have this institution, but for many communities, for example, in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, it feels very remote and very far away. And so I think engagement to learn and understand what these communities would like to hear from you and would like to know. Some of our partners have undertaken these incredible sort of discussions within the refugee camps to basically understand from survivors what they expect of international justice mechanisms. What do they expect from the ICC? What do they expect from the ICJ? What do they expect from the mechanism? And I think for the ICC and these international institutions to actually look deeply and understand in a really meaningful manner what is expected of them, and that you can only do from these communities. You need to have that deep engagement, not superficial engagement, and I think that's critical. And I think to understand that these are contexts that are all quite specific.
Yeah.
There are common themes and there are commonalities, but you do need to address the specifics of these contexts in the best way that you can, and that is really in coordination with local groups, in coordination with the community, in coordination with those who have been affected. Otherwise, there will still be gaps that still will need to be addressed. So,
yeah. And on the point about political will, I think it's really interesting to think about what the barriers are to enhancing political support, political commitment to some of the ways in which the ICC is trying to ensure that in a culture of accountability, at a time where we're considering ending impunity, all the big language, all the big promises that you hear in international justice. How do you get Asian states on board? And I think one of the things that is fundamental to important that you highlight is disaggregating what we think about when we talk about Asian states, right?
Yeah.
That one cannot approach it as a homogenous entity.
Absolutely.
So tell us a bit more. Help us to understand those deeper cleavages.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's a large region. There are very different approaches. It's also a matter of timing. There are certain times where you have the political winds that might be in your favor, that might move the needle a bit. There are other times where it's really regressive. So I think which is why I keep saying context is important, right? Understanding the nuance of the time in that particular situation and what might work and what might not. And I always think of that when I look at potentials for universal jurisdiction cases, for example. If you do want to file a case in a particular country, yes, legally, do you have a hook? Is it possible? But then also politically, is it smart to do it at a particular moment in time? But that's not to say that you should not be prepared.
Yeah.
You should have everything in place, and then you choose your moment. So I think that's something that is really important. We've been mapping Asian states on the ICC, on crimes against humanity, for a long time now. And it's interesting. So I'll give you an example. The Philippines, war on drugs. There's this ICC investigation going on, which, as you know, has been sort of green-lighted by the appeals chamber as well. Things are moving forward. The domestic jurisdiction has not addressed these cases. And I was in court in the Philippines, in the Supreme Court, sitting in the gallery, listening to the arguments that lawyers were making against the withdrawal of the ICC from the Philippines. And the point that came up from the government authorities, the Solicitor General, some of the Supreme Court justices, was, well, our domestic jurisdictions are capable of addressing these crimes, and that's something that we are doing. Therefore, we do not need the ICC. It's being taken care of. Patently untrue. The withdrawal has taken effect. Things are moving forward. The administration has changed. There's a new administration now that's come in, linked to the previous dictator. So the assumption is that they will continue the policies of the old government, which has been true. But 2 weeks ago, there seems to be a slight shift in the wind. There have been a few feeble statements from the government saying, we are considering re-engaging with the ICC. We are considering joining the ICC again. So I think you've got to keep your finger up and sort of feel the wind and know which way it's blowing.
Yeah.
In minute detail, to understand that this might signify engagement. It might be for political reasons internally, but that this might mean then that there's a window of opportunity to push the state on particular aspects. Initially on crimes against humanity last year, we sort of heard from the Philippines that they were not in favor. That seems to have changed a little bit. So it's a matter of tracking. It's a matter of trying to convince states as well, engaging with them constantly, and knowing that different states at different times, depending on the political situation, might come to it with a slightly different perspective. And I think capitalizing on that as well. And at the end of the day, I also do think it's individuals that make a difference. So legal advisors, ministers of justice, ministers of foreign affairs, who have a particular perspective of the world, who might be more supportive, that makes a massive difference in how we view these states as well. States aren't just behemoths and just entities devoid of human beings and people. So, but I think it's also being very practical and being very pragmatic about looking at these states and saying, okay, well, one or two, really, there's no point. That we will not move the needle, and engaging and trying to push them may not really give us results where we might have better results engaging with other states as well. So that's again a calculus, and that's a calculated sort of strategy that you take into account, looking at the legal architecture, looking at the political will, looking at the winds of change that are blowing or not. So it's a lot of factors that we take into account when we decide when and how to engage and who to engage with.
And which of those states are in that box of intractable? This is not where our efforts should go towards because the return is not going to be worth it. Let's focus the effort elsewhere. I ask that knowing the answer, as we both do, but I think it's important for us to articulate which states those might be and why.
India and China.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate given that it's sort of, the majority of the population of the world, just in terms of population and the number of people across these two jurisdictions. So it is really disheartening, and it's really, something that I say, and I wish it were different. I think China has made its sort of position quite clear, and so and I would say it's always interesting to go back to the official record.
Yes.
So go back to the April session, go back to what states have said on the record at the Sixth Committee, so you understand the perspective as well. China does not see the need for a Crimes Against Humanity treaty. Neither does India. It's seen as too soon, not relevant. I know India has made statements in the past saying we've got the domestic legal architecture in place, which is not correct. That is untrue. But I think and here's the problem as well. A lot of states in Asia and in Africa and in Latin America and in the developing world use the bogeyman of neocolonialism, and this is being imposed on us by Western powers, and I understand why that fear is flagged, right? I think we all do. We all know what that means. But it's used very opportunistically by a lot of these states in order to deflect and in order to not commit to some of these obligations. And it becomes an easy cop-out. It's, the immediate response is, well, this is being imposed, this is a Western project, this is a Western concept, and so we don't subscribe to it. Well, that's partly also because you've got states that are responsible potentially for the commission of these crimes, and this is an easy opt-out. And it's very difficult to counter that argument unless, we counter it from within. So civil society within these countries actually steps up and says, no, that is not correct. And I will put a caveat that there are, of course, issues in terms of institutions and dynamics and power relations. Yes, we all understand that. But that does not mean that you cannot sign up to these obligations. In fact, if you enter a treaty negotiation, you actually have the power to negotiate and to sort of recalibrate, if you will, how this would look and how it would work. So I think, from my perspective, it becomes really important to have a critical mass of states as well that are doing it for the right reasons, that actually want to commit because they feel on principle that either these crimes have been committed in their past history and they understand why it's important. And I saw this play out very clearly in the treaty negotiations in Ljubljana this year in May. So the Mutual Legal Treaty on cooperation for international crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. We had states there that, are powerful states that we assumed would be very supportive of the treaty, That was sort of the viewpoint going in. And then we started seeing these shifts in the 2 weeks that we were there, where states that we assumed would support the treaty started undermining it. And then what was crucial was to have this critical mass of states, small states, large states, states from developing countries, from the developed world, actually come together and push back and say, no, we do not agree with diluting these provisions. We are going to speak up, and we have a vote and we have a right to be part of these negotiations. And that really saved the day, because otherwise it could have been disastrous. It could, we could have ended up with a treaty at the end of those 2 weeks that was really devoid of its teeth, and which then we would not have supported. As civil society, we would have stepped back and said, okay, this process is done. It's been a disaster. We are not going to advocate for this treaty moving forward. But it was salvaged. And it was really because we had states that were in the room, that were not afraid to step up and to say, despite the power dynamics, right? So that there are political issues, there's foreign aid, there's, there are a lot of those levers that are being pulled, and you can see it through the treaty negotiations. So I think, to your point, yes, India and China, they are important just by virtue of their power and their prestige and the influence that they have on a number of states. But for me, it's you work with as many willing states as you can as well to get that critical mass. So at a crunch point, as we saw in Ljubljana, these states will actually save the day and step up as a group, strengthen numbers. That is something that becomes part of the calculus.
Yeah.
So,
and I think it also helps us to disrupt this idea of developing states in the global south being only passive actors, perhaps in the international plane, secondary actors, the less powerless one. I think there is space to disrupt that narrative and really think about these things from many different perspectives if we are to imagine international law making differently. And I think for me and for you, both coming from countries that are in the global south or developing nations, there is a massive critical mass of activists, scholars, lawyers, diplomats who exactly do what you say there. When the mobilization happens and the crunch time can arrives, I think it's then interesting to see how then power shifts.
Exactly.
So I totally take on board that point that you raise. To close, I want to ask a kind of open question, which I think is useful when we're working in this area, to just pause and think about, from your experience of working with a variety of stakeholders, civil society, states, international institutions, you name it, survivor and victims groups and their representatives, a whole array. How do you imagine justice, that big and powerful and beautiful concept? How do you imagine justice and what that could mean if we were sitting here again in 5 years' time?
That is at some level simple, but at some level so hard.
Very hard.
It is really, okay, so I would say, what does it mean, firstly, for the victim survivor community? Those are the communities that we have been entrusted to advocate on behalf of. And I said this yesterday, we had a panel, and the entire panel was composed of people who had very personal stakes in the situation in Afghanistan, Libya, Palestine, Ukraine, Venezuela. And, I was representing Myanmar on that panel. And the first thing I said was, this is a panel that truly has those stakes. And I am not from Myanmar, so I can only speak to some of this. But I think we need to recognize our positionality and where we're coming from.
Yeah.
In our discussions with a lot of the survivor groups, and this is where it is, it is really difficult. I had a conversation with someone who is Rohingya, who is a survivor, and it was at the start of the International Court of Justice case. And it was a very hard conversation because she told me that her assumption was that the ICJ case would move forward very fast and that she would get to go home. And it was very hard to sort of correct those expectations. It was a difficult conversation to say, look, it is going to take time and there's no guarantee that at the end of this, you get your citizenship, you get to go home, you get reparations. Those were her expectations. For some of the other survivors, the expectation is, I want to see someone in the dock. I want justice for what has happened to my mother, my brother, my family. And for some, it's all of this together. And so it becomes very hard, I think, for us to also think through potentially what might the consequences be of each of these different situations.
Yeah.
Is the end result of an ICC case that, everybody gets to go home? I worked at the Yugoslavia Tribunal for a few years, and I would sit in court and I would hear victim testimony and hear how the expectations of that court were really high for a lot of those who had survived the massacres, and what it meant for some of them to sit in that courtroom and testify against Milosevic and to be able to face their accusers. So yeah, it's so many different threads, and it's so individual as well, that it becomes hard to say there's one idea of justice or there's a one size fits all. And I think we need to be as comfortable as we can with those multiplicity of ideas of what justice means. For somebody, it might be just finding out where their parent or their relative is who's been disappeared. As simple as knowing the truth.
Yeah.
So some of the transitional justice mechanisms, Truth Commission, People's Tribunal, to be open to say that might deliver something for someone, even if you don't think it's necessarily the correct trajectory or it's necessarily what is needed. So I think it's hard. Groups are also divided in how they view these initiatives, what they want from them. And I think there's that ambiguity and there's a lot of discomfort in being comfortable with it. But I think that's something that you need to get a little comfortable, but not too comfortable either. To have that sense of constantly questioning what we're doing, why we're doing it, what will it deliver to the people who really want to see these processes move forward and succeed, and what does success look like, So it's complicated, as you know.
I think that's a powerful call to action, that being able to sit in that discomfort, that justice is not just one thing, and it is a multiplicity of things. And I think international criminal justice and those of us who work within that space have to, again, encourage more of that discomfort, more of that exploration, more of that openness that you're calling us to do.
Yeah.
Priya, thank you so much for your time and this very, very, very important conversation. I look forward to following your work and continuing to just see what happens within that space. Thank you for your time.
It was my pleasure, and I'm just so happy to connect back with you and to be able to chat to you in person in real life. So thank you for having me.
Fantastic.
Thank you.